Here is the thing that keeps me turning over in the middle of the night, the question I cannot file away. The ancient Greeks wrote about Antarctica, not as legend, not as a hopeful myth about a distant paradise, as a necessary geographic reality, a cold, enormous landmass sitting at the bottom of a spherical world. Aristotle called it Antarctos. He reasoned, with his characteristic precision, that because a great frozen mass existed in the far north, geometric and gravitational logic demanded a corresponding mass at the south. The world would be lopsided without it. He was working from pure theory, or so we are told. And that explanation, the theory explanation, is comfortable. It lets us fold Aristotle's southern continent into the category of intelligent speculation, a lucky guess by a rigorous mind. Most people accept this without much friction, and honestly, I understand why. Educated guessing is something ancient philosophers were extraordinarily good at. But here is where the comfort starts to develop small fractures, the kind you notice only when you step back and look at the whole wall. Because Aristotle was not the only one. The detail that keeps demanding attention isn't the name or the concept, it's the specificity that came after. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis completed a map of the world. It was assembled, he wrote himself, from older source maps, some of them ancient, some captured from Portuguese sailors, some of unknown origin. The map itself is strange and beautiful, and in places startlingly accurate. What appears on its southern edge is the problem. There, drawn with some care, is a landmass that corresponds geographically to the coastline of Antarctica. Not a vague blob, not a decorative flourish, a coastline with bays, peninsulas and inlets that match with uncomfortable precision the actual subglacial topography of the continent beneath its ice. Now, I want to be careful here, because the first rational response to that claim is entirely reasonable. Cartographers of that era routinely drew imaginary southern continents. It was a convention. The idea of a terra australis incognita, an unknown southern land, was common enough to be almost fashionable in Renaissance map-making circles. That explanation deserves serious consideration. But the specific problem with applying it to the Piri Reis map is this. Conventional terra australis drawings were enormous, vague, and theoretical. They were imagination dressed as geography. The southern edge of the Piri Reis map has specificity, particular bays, a curve that matches something real and buried. In 1958, a team of scientists conducting seismic surveys beneath the Antarctic ice sheet produced detailed maps of the subglacial terrain. What they found, the actual shape of the rock beneath kilometers of ice, was compared against the Piri Reis southern coastline by Charles Hapgood, a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Hapgood was not a fringe figure. He corresponded with Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to one of his books and described his hypothesis as worthy of serious consideration. Hapgood's argument was precise. The Piri Reis map showed a coastline that matched the sub-ice terrain of Antarctica with a degree of accuracy that could not be coincidental. The ice covering Antarctica is old in its deepest layers, millions of years in places, but ice cores have complicated that picture. Parts of the continent experience dramatically warmer conditions, possibly ice-free conditions at lower elevations, as recently as 6,000 years ago. That is not ancient in geological time, that is recent in human time. 6,000 years ago, human civilization, by the standard account, was just beginning to develop writing, agriculture, and organized city life in Mesopotamia and the Nile Delta. We were not, according to everything we think we know about ourselves, navigating to the bottom of the world and surveying ice-free coastlines. And yet the Piri Reis map is not alone. In 1531, Orontius Phineas produced a world map showing Antarctica in even greater detail: rivers, mountain ranges, a partially ice-free coastline. The interior features he drew correspond, unsettlingly, to the subglacial topography revealed by modern seismic surveys. He died in 1555. Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820. There is a gap of nearly 300 years between Phinems's map and the first confirmed Antarctic sighting. And yet his interior geography, drawn when no European or any person in the documented historical record had reason to know the shape of rock beneath the continental ice sheet, tracks the modern data in ways that demand explanation. I want to pause here because the skeptical counter-argument needs to be made clearly. It is possible, and some scholars argue this directly, that the correspondences between these maps and the actual subglacial terrain are not as precise as Hapgood and his supporters claimed. Map projection errors, wishful interpretation, and confirmation bias are all real phenomena. These are not trivial objections. I hold them seriously. When you want something to be true, you find patterns. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, especially in ambiguous data. I am not immune to that tendency, and neither is anyone who has ever stared at an old map and felt something click into place. But the projection error argument cannot fully absorb the specificity of what Hapgood found. He worked with cartographic students, applied mathematical corrections, and identified specific features: the Drake Passage, the Antarctic Peninsula, the Ross Sea, that appeared on maps drawn by people who should not have known they existed. That specificity is not the fingerprint of lucky guessing. And then you move to the Boaki map of 1737, drawn by a French royal geographer named Philippe Bourque. His Antarctic representation, and I want you to hold this for a moment, shows the continent divided into two separate land masses, joined at a central highland. For over 2 centuries, this was dismissed as pure fantasy. In 1958, geophysical surveys revealed that Antarctica is 2 separate geological landmasses beneath the ice: an eastern craton and a western archipelago, connected at a central ridge. Bourque's map, drawn 221 years earlier with no known source data, was structurally correct in a way that patient guessing simply does not explain. At this point, the rational instinct is to reach for the simplest explanation: convergent error. 3 maps, produced by 3 different cartographers in 3 different countries across 2 centuries, might have all happened to approximate reality through overlapping mistakes and lucky confabulations. It is not impossible, but it is becoming, the more you look at it, very crowded. Because the question the convergent error explanation cannot answer is what source maps was Piri Reis copying from. He told us himself, in the notes he left on the map, that he was working from older documents, some of them from the era of Alexander the Great, some of unknown origin. He was a compiler, not an inventor. If Piri Reis was copying older source maps, then the Antarctic detail was not his invention, it was inherited. The origin is pushed backward, not to 1513, but to wherever his sources came from. And if those sources were genuinely ancient, we are dealing with a chain of preserved geographic knowledge that the historical record has no framework to explain. This is where the coordination problem enters, and I find it more troubling than any single anomaly on any single map, because we are not talking about one institution or one tradition. We are talking about Ottoman naval archives, French royal cartography, and Renaissance Italian scholarship, all drawing on sources that appear to contain the same impossible knowledge. These were not allied institutions. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire and the French crown were intermittent rivals, and neither shared their cartographic intelligence with the other voluntarily. For them to share the same erroneous southern continent, if it were error, would be unusual. For them to share the same accurate one is something else entirely. I am not suggesting that someone coordinated this. That framing the secret keeper, the hidden hand, is actually the least interesting explanation available, because it requires an architect, and architects leave traces. What I am suggesting is something quieter and, I think, more plausible, that these cartographers were all drawing on the same deep well of source knowledge, a well whose origins have been lost or were never formally recorded, because the civilization that originally filled it did not survive in any form that our standard historical timeline has a category for. That is a strange sentence to write. I am aware of how strange it is, but strangeness alone is not a reason to refuse it. The mainstream position is worth stating fairly. Antarctica was discovered in 1820 by expeditions led by Bellingshausen, Bransfield, and Palmer, arriving nearly simultaneously. Before that, no confirmed human had seen the continent. The old maps are explained as coincidence, cartographic convention, or the lucky projection of geometric theory onto a real geography that happened to exist. And I want to be genuinely honest, this explanation covers most of the evidence with reasonable adequacy. Most. The difficulty is not that it explains nothing, it is that it leaves specific technical residue that it cannot dissolve. The subglacial terrain match, the structural division of the continent, the specificity of the bays and peninsulas. When I try to explain those details away with coincidence and convention, I find that I am doing something I distrust in myself. I am working backward from a preferred conclusion. And I try genuinely to notice when I am doing that, and stop. The problem is that the alternative explanation requires me to do the same thing. So I sit with both possibilities equally. An unknown civilization, advanced enough to map the world before recorded history, whose knowledge survived only as fragments copied by cartographers who didn't fully understand what they were tracing, or a series of remarkable coincidences that cluster together and mimic pattern without being one. Both remain open, neither closes cleanly. The Greeks come back into this, and they come back in an interesting way. Aristotle's Antarctos was theoretical. He said so, but Pythagoras, a century earlier, had argued that the Earth was a sphere, and that a sphere, to be stable, required equal weight distribution. He was describing physics, not geography. But physics, applied to a sphere, predicts Antarctica. There is a school of thought, not fringe but not mainstream either, that Greek geometric theory was itself derived from something older, that Pythagoras learned in Egypt, and Egypt had access to records that predate its own dynastic period, records whose content we can sometimes glimpse in the precision of their engineering and the sophistication of their cosmology. I want to be clear, this chain is speculative. From pre-dynastic Egyptian knowledge, to Pythagorean geometry, to Aristotle's southern continent, to Piri Reis's source maps, each link is unconfirmed. I am not asking you to accept it. I am asking you to notice that it forms a coherent line, not an incoherent scatter. What I keep returning to is the silence on the other side. If these maps are coincidences, they are very particular ones. If they are artifacts of cartographic convention, the convention was strangely accurate. And if there is a rational explanation that accounts for the subglacial terrain match without invoking prior knowledge, I have not found it written anywhere convincingly. The silence, I mean, is institutional. Academic geography has addressed the Piri Reis map. It has not been ignored, but the responses I find most often either dispute Hapgood's projections on technical grounds or point to Terra Australis as cartographic convention. Neither response fully confronts the question of the subglacial terrain correspondence. That gap is the thing. It is possible, and I want to offer this fairly, that the subglacial terrain comparison has been overstated by Hapgood and those who followed him. Scientific comparison of old map projections with modern seismic data is genuinely difficult. There are degrees of freedom in the analysis that can be manipulated, consciously or not, toward a desired outcome. I accept that. What I cannot set aside is Bourget. His structural division of Antarctica into two landmasses was not a projection comparison or a Bay curve approximation. It was a claim about the interior topology of an unreached continent, and it turned out to be correct in a way that feels categorically different from cartographic luck or educated theory. Now consider this: if even one of these maps reflects genuine prior knowledge, not theory, not convention, but actual survey data from an era before the historical record, then what we call the beginning of civilization is not the beginning of civilization. It is merely the beginning of the civilization whose records survived. That distinction matters enormously. We are accustomed to thinking of history as additive, that knowledge accumulates, that we know more now than anyone knew before, that complexity is a direction of travel rather than something that can be lost. The ice record, the map record, and the geological record all carry quiet evidence that complexity can also disappear. Entire cities have been swallowed by rising seas. Languages have died without leaving a single written trace. Civilizations have collapsed so completely that for centuries archaeologists did not believe they had existed until a shovel found them. We have learned repeatedly that the historical record is not a complete inventory of what has occurred on this planet. What Antarctica adds is specificity, not just the possibility of a lost civilization, but one that possessed maritime and cartographic technology, sophisticated enough to survey a frozen continent when it was not fully frozen, and precise enough that fragments of their work survived into the Renaissance on documents we still hold in libraries today. This is not Atlantis. I want to be precise about that, because the Atlantis association is a reflexive one that I think actually obscures the argument. Atlantis is a story. What I am describing is a physical document, a map on parchment in a library in Istanbul that contains geographic data its creator should not have possessed. Those are not the same category of claim. A myth is unfalsifiable. A map with measurable coordinates, drawn by a named historical figure that matches seismic data produced 445 years later, that is falsifiable. It has been tested. The testing has not produced a clean verdict, which is itself a form of information that deserves careful attention. Piri Reis was executed in 1553 on the orders of Suleiman the Magnificent over a dispute about treasure from a naval campaign in the Persian Gulf. His maps and his notes were archived. The 1513 world map was rediscovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul during a conversion of the palace into a museum. It had been sitting there for 400 years, unexamined. When it was finally analysed, the southern portion prompted immediate debate that has never fully resolved. The map was not hidden, it was not suppressed, it was simply waiting the way certain questions wait, for someone to look carefully enough to feel uncomfortable. And that is the quality of this particular mystery that I find most difficult to shake. It is not dramatic. It does not require secret societies or government cover-ups or missing files. It requires only that we look honestly at three things: a map, a seismic survey, and the gap between them, and ask whether coincidence is genuinely sufficient. If coincidence is sufficient, I can live with that. What I struggle with is accepting it without the complete argument, without someone producing a clear technical account of how the Piri Reis coastline arrived at its correspondence with the subglacial terrain by means that require no prior survey knowledge. That account has not been written to my satisfaction. Perhaps it exists, and I have not found it. That is a real possibility, and I hold it. I am not a professional cartographer or a geophysicist, and there may be literature in those fields that addresses the specific terrain comparison in ways I have not accessed. Intellectual humility requires me to name that gap in my own investigation. But I have read Hapgood's work and the criticisms of it, and I have found those criticisms focused mainly on his broader geological thesis, crustal displacement, rather than on the specific cartographic comparisons. The maps and the seismic data have not been decisively separated in any rebuttal I have found. That is the quiet center of the problem. There is another layer I want to bring forward carefully. The Orontius Phineus map shows what appear to be rivers flowing from an Antarctic interior toward the coast. Rivers require liquid water. Liquid water requires temperatures above freezing. Those conditions do not currently exist in Antarctica. If someone drew those rivers from a survey, that survey is very old. How old? Ice core data suggests that parts of the Antarctic coastal margin experienced warming events within the last 10,000 years, warm enough in localized regions to support meltwater drainage. 10,000 years ago is the Upper Paleolithic. It is before the pyramids. It is before writing. By the standard account, it is before civilization. I keep arriving at the same edge. Not a revelation, just an edge, past which the standard map of human history stops providing reliable guidance. The question is not whether an ancient civilization existed at the South Pole. The question is whether knowledge of what existed there survived in the things we copied without understanding. And that is the question the Greeks give us, in a strange way. Aristotle's Antarctus was theoretical. He said so. But what if the theory was informed by something older than theory? What if the philosophers who argued for a southern landmass were not speculating from geometry alone, but reasoning from records whose origins they did not fully disclose? Ancient Greek scholars were not monolithic in their methods. Many of them, Pythagoras, Plato, Thales, Solon, traveled to Egypt, to Babylon, to Persia, specifically to study knowledge that was older than their own civilization. Plato said explicitly that Solon brought back stories from Egyptian priests who spoke of events 10,000 years before their own time. Most scholars read that as embellishment, the mythologizing of a philosopher who wanted his Atlantis story to sound appropriately remote. I read it as something more interesting, a description of a real archival practice. Egyptian temple libraries held records. The Greeks read them. What was in those records that the Greeks then encoded, incompletely, into their own texts? I do not know, that is an honest answer, and I prefer it to a confident one that the evidence does not support. What I know is this: 3 maps produced across 2 centuries in 3 different countries contain geographic information about a continent that was not officially discovered until 1820, and that information sometimes matches the subglacial terrain beneath ice. I know that the historians who study these maps have not produced a fully satisfying technical refutation of the terrain correspondence. I know that the geological record shows Antarctica was warmer within a time frame that is geologically brief, but humanly ancient, and that these 2 facts are rarely discussed in the same sentence. That gap is not nothing, and I know that the Greeks named this place before anyone in the documented record reached it, not as dream or myth, but as geometric necessity. A fact that turned out to be correct not just in concept, but in specific physical details that pure speculation alone has difficulty explaining. That precision is where the question lives. What I do not know, and this is the part one sit with longest, is whether the knowledge was continuous or catastrophically interrupted. Whether someone, somewhere in the ancient world, had charts and coordinates that have simply not survived. Whether the source maps Piri Reis described actually existed, and what happened to them after 1513. I do not know what was in the libraries of Alexandria before they burned. I do not know what was stored in temple archives in cities now swallowed by earthquakes and time. I know only what survived the collapses, and I am increasingly uncertain that what survived is anything close to a complete picture. Maybe the Greeks simply guessed correctly, and the maps are coincidences stacked until they create the illusion of pattern. Maybe Hapgood was wrong, and someone will eventually produce the calculation that settles it cleanly. Maybe there is a rational explanation for every anomaly I have named, and I have simply not encountered it yet. That remains possible. But I have been sitting with this question long enough to know what it feels like when a mystery is approaching resolution, and what it feels like when it is not. Resolved mysteries contract. They become simpler the more you look at them. This one does the opposite. The more carefully you read the maps, the more the silence grows. And the silence eventually becomes its own kind of answer. Not to the question of what civilization mapped Antarctica's coast, not to the question of how that knowledge survived into the Renaissance in fragments and copies, but to the quieter question beneath all of it, how much we do not know about what we already were. There is a map in Istanbul. It is 500 years old. Someone made it from older maps. Those older maps are gone. On the edge of the one that survived, there is a coastline that matches rock sitting beneath ice that has covered it for thousands of years, and no one has fully explained how it got there. That is the door. I am standing at it. I have not opened it, because I am not sure I have the right key, or whether opening it leads somewhere, or simply into more corridor. What I know is that the door is there, and that it was there before I arrived, and that it will be there long after. The question is not what is behind it. The question is who built it, and when, and whether what they knew has been quietly encoded in documents we have been reading for centuries without understanding that we were reading it, and whether the ice slowly is beginning to tell the same story from the other direction.